Bosses of Reddit, have you ever fired someone and had them totally freak out? Witnessed my boss firing someone and it was super awkward. I work at a coffee shop and this girl would literally sit on the counters and eat muffins, complaining she had cramps and couldn't work. She was so fucking lazy and super annoying too. However, my boss is a huge softie and felt bad for her because he knew she had a rough life, which is very sweet. One day, she came in 2 hours late and he pulled her into the back and explained to her that if this ever happened again he would have to fire her. So, she gets up and opens the door and laughs super loudly in his face and screams out, "Fire me. Fire me. Yeah, fucking right. You don't have the fucking balls to fire me. I fucking dare you. You fucking pussy." My boss got up, walked to the doorway where she was now standing and replied, "Get the fuck out. You're fired." She honestly looked stunned, actually surprised that he did it. She began to walk through the store and knock shit down until my boss walked over to her calmly and said, No, you walk through the back door and get out of here or I call the cops." We never saw her again after that, thank God. Oh hell, so many times. The first time, I started working at a porn store. I had only started working there like 2 weeks earlier, but the manager told me I was now his assistant manager, and I needed to fire the night shift guy. I got a slight raise, so I figured I pretty much had to do it. I was only 21, and had very little work, or life, experience. I didn't know how to fire someone. But, I did it. I came into work the next morning to fire this guy. I didn't know what to say, so I was like, "Look, dude, I know this sucks, but as you know I've been made ASM, and my first order of business was to let you go." I barely got the words out before he was screaming at me, calling me names, telling me I didn't have the authority, and that he'd been there over a year, and he refused to get out from behind the counter. So, I called my manager. But since he was a raging alcoholic, he was still passed out cold at 9 AM. Meanwhile, the night shift dude called the owner of the business, who sent his son, one of the supervisors. I had the owner and the supervisor screaming at me, one in person, the other on the phone. The supervisor said that I needed to get the manager on the phone, and I better hope he answers, because if he can't fire him, he'd fire me instead. I called, and the manager finally answers. He has a conversation with the supervisor that lasts about 5 minutes or so, while I'm sitting there freaking out about the likely event of getting fired myself. After 5 minutes, the supervisor looks at night shift guy and says, "You're fired, get the fuck out." Then he turns to me and says, "Sorry about that. The fuckhead manager never actually promoted you. He was just too much of a coward to do his job." 2 weeks later, I was the manager. I've never had anyone really freak out. Most people just get really sad. Some beg for another chance. A few have just cried. But the best one, in terms of ease, was a woman I called into my office. She sees me and the our manager sitting there. Before any of us can say anything, she says, "Am I fired?" I say yes. She walks out of the office, gets her personal belongings from her desk, which consisted of about 4 things, and walks out the door never to be seen again. I wish they all went that way. If by freak out you mean pull out a handgun and commit suicide, then yes, I fired someone and had them freak out. His branch manager loathed him with the intensity of 1,000 suns, and when she got word that I was coming down to terminate his employment the next day, she couldn't help herself and told everyone in the office. Naturally, word got back to him about 3 seconds later. I showed up late the next morning, and as soon as I hit the door, he stood up from his desk and said, "You're not going to fire me," and pulled a 45 out of his briefcase. This was back in the day when people still carried briefcases and kept all their work in them. In other words, pre-laptop days. He chambered around, turned it around, tried to pull the trigger, but the palm grip safety was cock blocking him. Like a nitwit, I jumped on him and tried to get the gun away from him, but he was so slick with sweat I slid off him. He finally figured out where he went wrong, put the gun up to his chest, and blew a small hole in the front and a really big hole in his back. Total pandemonium. I fired one girl and her father came into my store and freaked out on me. I let him stand there and scream at me for a couple minutes Told him if he wanted to know why I canned his adult daughter he could ask her, and told him to get out of my store before I escorted him out. He threatened to kick my ass, and I got in his face and asked if he really thought he could beat up someone half his age, who also happened to be a bouncer. He left. Another kid I fired because he was a shitty worker. He had asked for a day off that he was normally scheduled to work. I told him to find someone to cover the shift. He never even asked any of his coworkers, or even me, to cover it. The day he wanted off rolls around, and he doesn't show. I call his cell, and he tells me he's 8 hours away, and he had told me he wanted it off. I told him to not bother coming back in, and he immediately accused me of firing him because he was black. I replied that he was being fired because he was a shitty worker who would spend more time arguing why he shouldn't have to do something I asked him than it would have taken to do said thing. He claimed that his mom's friend was a lawyer and the guy had been telling him that he had the basis for a real good case against me for being racist. I told him good luck, I'd see him in court with my 6 black siblings, and hung up on him. He called my boss and gave him the same bullshit story, so my boss caved and gave him a job at another one of our stores. He got fired after 2 months for being repeatedly late, then finally not showing up for a shift. Let me count the ways. Worked in a restaurant with multiple black female line cooks. Fired one girl for insubordination, profanity towards a customer, and attempting to start a fight with same customer. She slapped me. 3 other female cooks immediately began knocking the shit out of her and threw her out the back door. Customers called the police because they thought someone was getting murdered on the line. Hired as an executive chef at upscale sports bar after current chef no-showed for 3 days. My first day on the job, the former chef finally appeared like nothing had happened. I informed him he no longer had a position. He began trashing the office, wrecking the computers, credit machines, everything not nailed down. I stepped out, called the police, and had to eventually tackle the guy when he went for a knife. Multiple occasions after terminating servers, the former servers would have a tantrum walking through the restaurant. One in particular ripped the tablecloth with family's meals onto the floor while screaming obscenities. I've had my tires slashed, threatening mail and emails, and numerous threats of bodily harm. Fun times. Fun times. Not a boss, but watched someone get fired at a Carl's Jr. One time. The person in front of me in line WQS being an obvious dick to one of the employees, semi-harassing him, taking forever just to order a burger. The guy behind the counter finally had enough of his shit, yelled fuck this shit, I don't make near enough to put up with your bullshit, jumped over the counter, and decked the guy in the face. After the asshole customer was laying on the ground, the employee hopped back over the counter and asked me what I wanted. Safe to say he didn't finish or even start taking my order before his manager came out screaming and told him to go. Definitely my best experience at a fast food restaurant. My boyfriend had a guy fired at his job a few months ago. He doesn't technically have the ability to fire anyone, but he makes the recommendation to his boss, and then the person is gone. His boss would always default on his recommendation as he's the person in direct supervision of them. The guy apparently kept coming to work drunk off his ass. My boyfriend tried to let it slide, and the first few times made comments like starting the weekend a little early, but then it got to the point where it was happening more regularly, and he flat out told him that he had to stop drinking on the job or he was going to get fired. The guy was drunk again a few weeks later, so he was fired. This guy, drunk off his ass, started screaming about how it wasn't fair that he was being fired for being drunk because my boyfriend does cocaine all the time and is clearly always stoned, and that he should be the one getting fired, and a whole bunch of shit. My boyfriend does none of that and offered right away to go take a drug test, to which his boss responded that it wasn't necessary because the guy getting fired was obviously just pissed off. Then he started to threaten my boyfriend's life. He did know where we live. My boyfriend walks to work most days, and they had been friendly before he started coming in drunk all the time, so it had come up in conversation. He told my boyfriend that he'd be waiting outside for him one day and that he would regret having him fired. He also knew which car was my boyfriend's. It's parked right outside our window, and threatened to damage that. The guy was an ex-con who had gone to jail on assault and drug charges and had mentioned having previous connections to shady people in a town nearby that it known for its gang activity. They sent my boyfriend home that day and his boss actually gave him a ride so he didn't have to walk the half mile alone. They sent the guy home, but he came back a few hours later and took a microwave and a blanket from the warehouse. My boyfriend speculated later that he was living there part of the time. I used to be a manager at a KFC and had to fire this girl for overuse of her cell phone. Got so bad, I would take it from her at the start of shift. She would talk on it in front of customers, text constantly, and never follow through with her duties. About 16 or 17. I started taking her phone at the start of shift, but I never really checked her phone. Turns out she got another and gave me her old one with no service. Caught her texting under the register one day, told her to leave. She freaked out and shouted and screamed at me, said she needed the job, wanted another chance, etc. But I had already given her a bunch of chances. She ended up throwing stuff all the way out the door, dumped a whole tray of chicken on the floor, knocked over plate stacks, etc. I witnessed this crazy lady I worked with at veterinarian office get fired. It was one of those, you can't fire me because I quit scenarios. Classic. She made a big scene screaming and yelling about how we were nothing without her, while everyone just kinda stared at her with blank expressions. She finally makes her way out to her car, just to reverse it a little bit, and put it back in park. I see her speed walking back towards the building. At this time, I was a little nervous about what the hell she was doing. She walked in, not saying a word to anyone, grabbed 2 stools in one of the back rooms, brought them outside and smashed them into pieces right in front of the window. In her defense, I found out later that she bought those stools a while ago for the office. Everyone's reaction to this was the best part, just watching, looking confused but calm. Then, when it was all over, we all kinda just looked at each other, shrugged and then went back to work. I didn't do the firing, but I was in the meeting. Sia fired the director of sales, so dude who clearly has anger issues gets up, starts yelling about how he's going to beat the hell out of Sia if they ever cross paths in public, storms out breaking the office door and the door to the stairwell. For the next month, he would drive back and forth in the parking lot for 10 to 15 minutes, a few times a day waiting for Sia to come out. The guy had no problem with me, nor I with him. He was purposely acting a fool, because Sia is a complete idiot, and we'd laugh about it whenever we crossed paths. Of course, he was charged with destruction of property, threatening with bodily harm, etc. Not sure whatever happened to him. I was driving a pickup truck with a guy when I fired him, and his response was to jump at me, like the way kids would jump at each other in school in an attempt to make them flinch. 2 for flinching. Remember that? Yeah, that's what it was like. There was one minor difference, however. This was a frail 62-year-old black man who looked like Red Fox. If he and I had actually gotten in a fight, I would have seriously hurt this guy. He was being a belligerent fuck up and 100% deserved the firing, but in that moment his pathetic attempt to physically intimidate me was probably one of the saddest and most depressing things I had ever seen in my life. I took the rest of the day off because hey, I'm the boss, right? I ended up drinking for most of the night. That encounter really shook me, though, and I still think about that guy a lot. Hope you're doing well, ERNIE*, even if you were an asshole. Asterisk for the sake of honesty, I feel like I should point out that this was not actually his name. I had about 5 to 6 write-ups on this girl at work. She consistently had a crap attitude at work, would wander off to make long, painfully detailed personal phone calls, was confrontational and volatile. My documentation was impeccable, and I wrote down, verbatim, every single one of our check-ins, verbal warnings, constructive criticism conversations, etc. And I'll let her know this, every time. The day that we sat down with our director, to tell her she either needed to move to a different position in a different location or leave the agency, she sat stone-faced, while the director read off the exquisitely detailed and specific, with dates and times, incident reports, then asked if she recalled any of those incidents. She stood up and started a slow clap. She looked me in the face and went, "Oh, Nutella sandwich, brilliant. Well played." You got me. How proud of yourself are you? Amazing. Fantastic. Good for you. Good for you. Are you happy with yourself? This is just great. I sat there and stared at her until she stopped. She sat back down, cleared her throat, and said, I had no idea this is how you felt about me, Nutella sandwich. I really wish you had come to me sooner. Started blubbering like a baby about how fragile she is, and in the next sentence, claimed I hadn't been direct enough with her and just needed someone who wouldn't hold my hand and would just man up and tell me what to do. Director looked at her dumbfounded and said, well, no one has ever called Nutella sandwich a handholder before, but if you insist. She then placed her in a location with a high turnover rate and this biggest hardest in the agency. She quit soon after marrying one of their staff on a whim. Fun. Also had a woman burst into tears and tell me I was firing her from her entire life. I informed her that if her job was her life then maybe she should think about taking up some hobbies. Handholder? I think not. In my long and spotty career I can only remember getting fired once. Actually I wasn't fired, I went to get a fax and accidentally intercepted a fax from the company's lawyer discussing the legal ramifications of firing me. I went to my boss's office and told him I was taking the rest of the day off, without explanation. I just walked. So I guess that was a little weird. That night I had a dream I was in an airplane, and I went to the bathroom. When I opened the door to step in, I just fell out of the plane, and suddenly woke up. In Germany people sometimes successfully sue to get their jobs back when they are fired. I knew a totally useless sales guy who did that. It was an English company and they didn't know German law very well. The company gave him a desk in a storage room. You had to climb over boxes to get to it. He stayed on for a while but finally quit.